鬼岛之音
Ghost Island Media. Welcome to the Taiwan Take by Ghost Island Media. I'm your host, Emily Y. Wu. Today, we speak to a German politician who has been a familiar name in Europe and Taiwan relations. We'll talk about navigating a relationship with Taiwan for European member states, European Parliament delegations to Taiwan, and how these members might be watching the Taiwanese general election. To discuss all of this with us today is Reinhard Bütikofer.
It's also our values. I think it's the responsibility of democracies to show solidarity with democracies.
Reinhard has been a member of the European Parliament since 2009, where he sits on the Foreign Affairs Committee. He is chairperson of the Delegation for Relations with China and an alternate member of the Committee on International Trade. He also co-chairs IPAC, the Inter-Parliamentary Alliance on China. Thank you for joining us this morning, Reinhard.
Thank you for having me.
Where are you coming from? It's 9 a.m. and you are a really busy man. And thank you today for this time with us.
It's a pleasure. It's always a pleasure to work on enhancing the mutual understanding between Taiwan and Germany for one part and the European Union for the other.
Reinhard, we met in person for the first time last year in December 2022 when you organized the inaugural Berlin Taiwan Conference, which we will talk about later. So your political career has spanned 4 decades.
More than that.
More than that, okay.
I first got elected as a student representative, a rebellious student representative in 1973.
That was when you were in college at Heidelberg.
Yeah.
Let's talk about the early days of activism. What made you be a rebellious student in the first place that made you want to participate in civic conversations?
Well, look, the years around 1968 and the following years were a period of youth activism and in particular student activism around the globe. And at the time, the Vietnam War played a major part in that regard. Mm-hmm. And that was something we discussed almost every day. How should we position ourselves? Mm-hmm. And I happened to spend a year in high school in the United States before I went to college. Mm-hmm. So I had learned about the internal debates in the U.S. and how strongly critical voices in the U.S. opposed the Vietnam War that had an impact on us. But there were other issues also, like dealing with our own Nazi past in Germany that had been covered up to a large degree by some of the previous generations. Mm-hmm. There were issues about reforming the educational system. So that was quite a sweeping movement at the time. And Heidelberg was one of the hotspots in Germany.
When you were elected into office for the first time, you were 31 years old. Mm-hmm. And from there on, it's city council, it's state assembly, and then the parliament. You served as the German delegate for the European Green Party for a decade before your role as its chairperson from 2012 to 2019.
Right.
And you've been an MEP for 14 years. You've witnessed a lot of changes in the world. You know, as a 31-year-old, it's 1984. You're now in city council. What was the mood like in politics then in Germany that set you off in the direction into this long career that you would have?
In the early 80s, there was a mood that promised a new political beginning. And that was largely associated with the development of the German Greens Party. The rebellious movements of the 70s had either died down or been oppressed. Some of the more radical proponents veered off into terrorism. And the Greens started off by distinguishing themselves in one central issue against those movements from the 70s, stating that political nonviolence was the necessary and indisputable paradigm for political work in a democracy. But on that basis, and with feminism as one of the drivers, and with environmental concerns as one of the drivers, and with issues around the role of ethnic minorities or other minorities as one of the drivers, individual emancipation as one of the major goals, the early 80s were shaped to some degree by this upcoming Greens movement. The first Green state representatives were elected in 1980. The first Green representatives in the German parliament on a national level were elected in 1983. And in Heidelberg, where I lived at the time in 1984, we competed in the municipal election and won 20% of the seats in our first campaign. And at the time, Heidelberg was still an extremely conservative town, partly because the student radicalism had sort of really enhanced a conservative backlash effectively. And we tried to open new doors and to create spaces for alternative ways of thinking and living. And that was quite a hopeful phase at the time. I still think back to that, and we were able to take a realist approach and still have major cultural transformations as a success.
At the time, the issues that were on your radar, how much did you look internationally?
Well, I always, as long as I can think back, I always had a particular focus on the United States and the relationship with the United States, partly for the reason that members of my family emigrated to the United States after the First World War and after the Second World War also. And we had contact. So that was a part of our reality, the relationship. And then after having spent a year in high school in Wisconsin, I had my own experience with the U.S. So that was something I always paid attention to. And then early on in 1970, I got interested in China. And that was a real coincidence, I would say. If you allow me to relate that story, I was traveling through the south of England with my best friend, taking a bicycle tour. And while we were in London, it was, as they say, raining cats and dogs. And so in order to avoid getting all wet, we went into a bookshop and I discovered a Penguin series, Teach Yourself, and then 70 different languages. And I was very interested in learning languages. So I was immediately fascinated. And after, I don't know how much time, the storekeeper came and said, "Young man, you may not have noticed, but it stopped raining." And I immediately had a very bad conscience. So I knew I had to buy one of the books. And so I had to take a fast decision between Teach Yourself Swahili and Teach Yourself Chinese. And I opted for Chinese and started right away scribbling characters and trying to learn phrases. And that's how I got into contact with China. And ever since, I've been interested and involved with China.
When was the first time you visited China?
1974.
Wow, almost immediately.
Yeah.
What was that trip like? As somebody who picked up a language book just randomly like that.
I, of course, then went on to study Chinese history, some Chinese culture. I also tried to study classical Chinese when I went to Heidelberg University in 1971. And I dropped that later to focus on philosophy and history. But I also got involved then with modern China. And the Maoist groups were particularly strong in Heidelberg. So at some point, I joined one of those groups and tried to understand the developments in China from that angle. I can, of course, I have to say in hindsight that a lot of what I thought I knew at the time was, well, not exactly knowledge, but make believe, and maybe also encouraged by a will to fool oneself. But later on, I stayed the course. I stayed involved, even though I changed my perspective and got involved more with human rights issues, for instance.
So from there on, the 70s and then 80s, you were in city council and then state council. By your last year at State Assembly was 1996.
Yep.
That same year, over here in Taiwan, Taiwan was holding its first presidential election. Citizens rejoiced. Finally, for the first time in Taiwanese history, the people could elect by popular vote our leader. That was also the first time the rest of the world saw China's military aggression towards Taiwan. By that year, you have held multiple leadership positions within the Green Party. What were the discussions on Taiwan back then?
Almost none. Taiwan was not on my radar screen very much. And I don't think that I was more ignorant than the average. The real focus at the time was on the PRC and on Deng Xiaoping's policy of reform and opening up. And there were great hopes, I should probably say illusions, that a policy of, as we called it in German, Wandel durch Handel, change through engagement, in particular through economic engagement, through trade, would end up transforming the political realities also in the mainland. There was this famous quote from a former president of the World Bank, Bob Zoellick, who expressed the hope that the PRC would become a responsible stakeholder, as he said, a participant in a shared international order. And of course, that hope was coupled with a policy also of economic greed. A lot of corporate investors went to China to earn wagon loads of money successfully. And Taiwan was, well, on the sidelines at best. It seemed we had the impression also that the situation across the Taiwan Strait was relatively stable. I mean, there had been this quote from Deng Xiaoping that if the Taiwan issue could not be solved in his own generation, maybe it should be handed down to the next generation or the generation thereafter to have them solve it. So that was an attitude displayed by the supreme Chinese leader that seemed to be stabilizing the situation. And it took a while until we started realizing how much the PRC was a different kind of animal as regards its overall character, and that those general hopes were misguided, but also how much it went after sort of transforming the relationship with Taiwan. And that first emanated, of course, after 2000, after the DPP had for the first time won the presidential elections.
Yeah. And fast forward to the words, conversations around Taiwan is now very different. Conversations around the goodwill of China is very different. Just for examples, this is one of your speeches and debates from 2022. We should not be delusional. If you forget about what China does, China doesn't forget about you. You see that in the case of Lithuania. China is willing to break all international rules to pursue its hegemonic imperial goals. At what point would you say, when did this tilt? What were some of the pivotal points for you that this changed so much?
For me, a major rupture came when Xi Jinping took over control of the CCP. Between 2010 and 2012, I had been engaged in a broadly based effort of dialogue between European political parties, including conservatives, liberals, social democrats, Greens, and left, with the international department of the CCP. We ran conferences together. We always insisted that we should include topics that the CCP did not like and succeeded in putting those on the agenda. but it was a kind of an effort to see how far dialogue could get us. Mm-hmm. And we had a constant battle. I was the European coordinator of that effort. We had a constant battle about their interfering and so on. But we still had the hope that we could find a basis for a managed controversy. Mm-hmm. And then after Xi Jinping took over, in the beginning of 2013, a delegation from the international department came to Brussels and told us, from now on, it's our rules, and our rules only. And that was when we severed that cooperation and said, well, if it's your rules, then you go play, but not with us. And all the people that we had worked with before that were relieved of their positions, were put somewhere else. So early on, I had the impression that Xi Jinping's takeover was not veering into a reformist direction, but was probably going to create a political backlash. And when I then saw the infamous document number 9 of 2013, where the CCP denounced constitutionalism and freedom of the press and all these purportedly obnoxious Western concepts, I was convinced that this was going backwards. And then you saw increasingly steps by the supreme leader to turn what had been a communist aristocracy into a system governed by a party emperor.
How long would you say that, I mean, as a Taiwanese person, looking back to that time, I remember Xi Jinping building up his strength, and you get the sense that he's he's in it for a very long time. That was 2013, 10 years ago. Taiwan and how Taiwan was internationally, it was definitely not what it was today. From your position within the European Parliament, at what point did you begin to see there was room for partnerships with Taiwan outside of the China framework?
Well, I think that was about maybe 2017. 2016 was an eventful year in our China relations because the economic contradictions between the European side and the German side in particular and the PRC became more obvious and moved more to center stage. We had controversies about anti-dumping policy. We had controversies about other trade defense instruments we needed because of unfair trade and investment policies on the PRC side. We refused in that year to grant China the market economy status. We witnessed the takeover of one of the crown jewels of German robotics technology by a Chinese firm, namely Midea. KUKA bought Midea. That had a huge impact. We saw the Made in China 2025 strategy publicized and looked into that and found it was not a strategy that promised long-term partnership, rather the opposite. So I think that was a year when also business in Europe began to realize that there was a dynamic on the part of the PRC that would be much more worrying than anybody had expected. And I think that was the time when we began also looking more towards Taiwan. And then a major turning point for the European Parliament as such was early in 2019, when Xi Jinping gave a very aggressive speech about Taiwan. We had known for many years that the CCP had never reneged on the claim that Taiwan should be united with the motherland and that they would possibly resort to military means in order to achieve that goal. But this particular speech early in 2019 seemed to us to be extremely aggressive and to put that issue on the agenda in a different way, in a more pressing way. And the reaction to that in the European Parliament was that we then organized the first ever debate exclusively discussing Taiwan. before that, Taiwan had been mentioned here and there in some documents, but there had never been a Taiwan-focused debate in the European Parliament. That was our reaction to Xi Jinping. And then after that, we also went on to draft a Taiwan-centered report and enhanced also the parliamentary relations to Taiwan. So in the meantime, 3 different committees from the European Parliament have officially visited Taiwan. Before that, it would have been individual legislators going. Now it's committees doing that on official business. So basically, Xi Jinping and the aggressive policies of the leadership in Beijing forced us to take a stance because we all agreed, and we have a wide-ranging consensus in the European Parliament from the conservatives to the Greens, including all the major democratic groups, that we want to defend the status quo. But if China continues trying to undermine the status quo, we have to invest more to bolster the status quo. That's basically the basis of our approach.
All that you have described again and again is in response to China's making statements of such, China's taking actions in such. But also in around 2019, during that recent pivotal point, there was also suppression of freedom in Hong Kong that you had called out. You also call out China for its suppression of Uyghurs and for its economic sanctioning against European states like Lithuania. In the same time, so you would call on the European state to refocus on Taiwan. Is that what that means? What does it mean to refocus on Taiwan?
Well, in my understanding, that means that we take Taiwan as a real partner and that we respect Taiwan on the basis of its own merits, and that we don't just look Taiwan through the China prism. There are some, and there's still some, I would assume, that just look at Taiwan in the context of what that means for our China relations or in the context of our China relations. But I think the vast majority of the European Parliament would not be confident and happy with such an approach. We feel that Taiwan's vibrant democracy and its pluralism and its thriving economy and Taiwan's success with regard to management, for instance, of health issues, in particular the COVID pandemic and many other aspects, should be the basis for a relationship with Taiwan as a real partner. And I think that's the new attitude that has been spreading also from the European level to the member states. I would say this is now also, for instance, the position of the German government, whereas prior to the change of government in 2021, the word Taiwan never appeared in an official German government document. Now it is clearly stated that we, as a government, support not only the status quo in the Taiwan Strait and oppose any unilateral change there, in particular through force, but we also explicitly state that we support meaningful participation of Taiwan in international organizations. So this change of attitude is now more widely shared than ever before.
What do you say to members who are still skeptics of that, though? There's people who say, well, maybe what's happening there, that's not my business. Or they say, well, look, every member state, every country, we still have our priorities. How do you get the rest of everybody else on board?
Well, frankly, those people that oppose the kind of position that I've just described in the European Parliament are only radicals from the right or from the left, extremists. And I don't really argue with them because I think that would be just in vain. Some of them clearly, either they do it for ideological fixations or they've been bought by Beijing. But I mean, discussing with them makes no sense. But if somebody has a serious question mark, I would say that It is for three reasons that we pursue such an approach. Number one, we have obvious stakes in the stability in that region. For instance, half of the container trade worldwide goes through the Taiwan Strait. Europe, being so dependent on international trade, obviously has a stake in stability there. Also, Taiwan is an important partner in different industrial sectors. That's why we have a stake and an interest in stability. Second, it's also our values. I think it's the responsibility of democracies to show solidarity with democracies. We should strive to create a phalanx of democracies that are cooperating on the basis of principled solidarity. And third, Taiwan plays a major role with regard to the stability in the Indo-Pacific in a larger sense. And as the Indo-Pacific has become the economic center of the globe, that has repercussions worldwide. So geopolitical, if you will, there is also a very good reason to invest in stability there. And peace is the best stabilizer other than military aggression.
First of all, I agree with all of these reasons that what happens in Taiwan, it is tied to the world. But there's also, I'm reading a lot of speeches on how the European Parliament, how the European states must act together and have a consensus on whether it's one China policy or how this trade is conducted. What is the risk if there isn't solidarity? Taiwan isn't a part of many of these organizations where you're called on solidarity to act together. So how can one understand, how do you strike that balance for European state to have your own priorities, but also consensus?
Look, I think in an organization like the EU that is without parallel in world history, because it brings together 27 sovereign nations that try to form a common policy on so many different dimensions, from health to security, from green transformation to social and so on. You will never have perfect consensus. That's impossible. There will always be different flavors to some degree. And I don't think it's necessary in a democratic institution to have perfect consensus. It is important to have a reliable process that allows to sort of negotiate a position that is as close to the best option for everybody as possible. And sometimes people veer off that ideal. For instance, French President Macron, after visiting the PRC and having been lured by the CCP leadership with all kind of lavish attention, he ventured beyond our European consensus, saying, basically, Taiwan was none of our business. And you saw what happened then. There was a huge backlash. There were very, very few people who supported his point of view. And everybody else basically, more politely or less politely, told him, look, guy, you have to rethink. So even though on the surface there was an obvious disagreement, the effect was that the shared understanding was rather strengthened in the process of the ensuing discussions. And I believe that we have come a long way in that regard. Giving you, again, an example from Germany, when the last government, under the leadership of Chancellor Merkel, published their Indo-Pacific strategy, the word Taiwan didn't appear. Somehow there was an Indo-Pacific strategy and Taiwan was not even mentioned. Now, the new government revisited that strategy and came up with a new draft, improved draft, and then there Taiwan is on the agenda. Or looking at trade relations. Obviously, we do not have neither a free trade agreement nor bilateral investment agreement, but there are trade dialogues, and those trade dialogues have been enhanced between Taiwan and the European Union moved up to a higher level. I would say that all of this really demonstrates the will to effectively put efforts behind our words. Still, I think we have to show some more determination and some more realism also. For instance, we've had a contentious debate between the European Parliament and the European Commission over the issue of a bilateral investment agreement between the EU and Taiwan. And the European Parliament, with huge majorities, has always supported that claim, trying to support Taiwan's position in that regard. Mm-hmm. The European Commission has rejected that. In more recent conversations, for instance, with Deputy Minister Roy Chun-Lee from MFA in Taipei, I have come to the conclusion that maybe BIA is not even the most urgent goal. Maybe we should rather look at trade facilitation issues, at resilient supply chain issues, because when you talk to Taiwanese businesses, whether they see major impediments investing in Europe, they say no. And when you talk to European businesses, whether they see major impediments to investing in Taiwan, they say no. Mm-hmm. So why fix it if it ain't broken? So why have a BIA as the main objective if that's not the main problem? Maybe we should rather listen to the businesses and try to address the issues that they have. And I think that would be a more realistic approach. And as I understand what the deputy minister has been saying, that's also his thinking. And so in that regard, we have to find new ways. Or when we talk about the meaningful participation of Taiwan in international organizations like, let's say, UNFCCC about climate, or Interpol, or ICAO, or what have you, or WHO in particular. Mm-hmm. Well, I would say we have had a kind of ritualized practice 6 or 8 weeks before these organizations meet. Members of the European Parliament sent open letters to the leaders of these organizations saying, well, we would hope that Taiwan could be included. Mm-hmm. I mean, that is not really an effective way of dealing with the issue. I mean, if you want Taiwan being able to play its role in the WHO or WHA, for instance, you have to mobilize doctors' associations. You have to mobilize civil society. You have to do an all-year-long campaign to really get there instead of just raising it ritually every year at a given time. So I think there are issues where we can be more effective in doing what we're doing.
Hey, if you have enjoyed the Taiwan Take and would like to support Ghost Island Media, we take monthly donations on Patreon. We're at patreon.com/Taiwan. And please give us a good rating on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. This helps other people find the show. All right, thank you. And back to the show. That brings me to the Berlin Taiwan Conference that you've been organizing. Is that part of the effort to bring this conversation more widely to the rest of the public so that it isn't just politicians and trade? It's also talking to people from the business entities, from academia to civic society, and also government, of course, which was the types of people who came together for the first annual conference in December 2022, in which I had the honor of being a panel member. The title of the conference was Taiwan, Opportunities and Challenge in Times of Political Change. There were panels on democracy, on economy, on supply chain, on resilience, as you've just talked about. Is that the thinking behind why have such a conference? And then later I also wanted to ask you, what was the organization behind this like, whether there were pushbacks from the community, from politicians, or whether it was met with indifference by others or overwhelming support by the colleagues?
Thank you for asking, because this is really very dear to me. This year we did the second such conference, and it also met with a lot of interest. And I hope that we can turn that into a enduring tradition. And the original aim was twofold. Number one, putting Taiwan on the radar screen. I mean, just imagine, Berlin is really not the least important capital around Europe, but it's never had an event that focused publicly on Taiwan. That can't be just continued. If we mean that, we have to have spaces for exchange. And the second aim has been to focus on Taiwan as it evolves, as it develops. And again, not just look at Taiwan through the China prism. And this year, for instance, we had one of the panels looking at how different societies have been dealing with their authoritarian or totalitarian past, like Taiwan dealing with the White Terror, Russia dealing with the Stalinist terror, Germany dealing with the Nazi regime. And we compared that in a panel with people from Memorial, from Russia, and from the German context. Or we had Ethan Tu from AI Labs, so giving a keynote about how civil society in Taiwan is engaging in countering fake news and foreign interference and information manipulation, and how civil society can play an active role. And we organized that in particular to learn from the experience. So basically, this is indeed about engaging, and I know that there are going to be further steps of enhancing that engagement between civil society on the Taiwanese side and on the German side too. When you ask about the reaction, there's two notable reactions that I would want to highlight. One is that I asked a number of business leaders whether they would speak, and there was a certain reluctancy.
Business leaders in Germany?
Yeah, in Germany. And when I look at the political spectrum, there was a lot of positive feedback. And we had participation also from other political parties, conservatives, liberals, socialists. So this is not a topic that divides us. That's one of the positive sides.
How do you tackle the business community? To the person that said no, how do you make sure they come speak the next year?
Well, I'll have to think hard about that. But I think the interesting thing about discussions in the business community is that they are not homogenous. I would say there are effectively two camps in the German business community. And one camp is led by the CEOs of some multinationals like BASF or Volkswagen or Mercedes or Siemens. All these guys have put way too many eggs into that one Chinese basket. And they have made themselves dependent to a questionable degree, to say it mildly. And some of them see no other way than increasing their footprint in China and doubling down on this strategy. I find that, as I say, questionable. But there are other voices from industrial associations, like the German Federation of Industry in particular, that came out with a very critical China strategy in 2019 already, or from the small and medium-sized enterprises that take a very much more cautious approach. There has been a study done by a research group called the Rhodium Group, I think last year, where they looked into European foreign direct investment going into China over the 3 previous years. And they came to the conclusion that 80 to 85% of all European FDI into China was from 10 companies alone.
Wow.
While others, in particular the small and medium-sized companies, were withholding investment or divesting even some a certain percentage even divesting or diversifying. So trying to make themselves less vulnerable by becoming less dependent on that one big partner, China. So in that context, I think you will see further debates. We now have the concept of de-risking to try to describe the overall economic and political strategy for European policy vis-a-vis Beijing. And in that context, I think you will see further also public debate. The CEO of Mercedes just recently said in the public very critical words about the China strategy of the German government, basically taking, I would say, the Chinese point of view. Now, Mercedes has Geely as an investor. Mercedes, I think, has Chinese investors up to almost 20%. And they feel they're dependent on the market. So you may hear greed over reason. But that cannot be avoided. And I think there will be other voices becoming more prominent also. And even some of the big multinationals are beginning to realize that they should maybe pursue a more cautious approach. I mean, they have seen the example of the rail industry, for instance. Before China became a superpower in fast rail transport, they learned from three companies, Siemens, Alstom, Bombardier. Some of the tech transfer was by agreement, some was by theft, IP theft. Now that CRRC, the Chinese state monopolist, has become twice as large as the rail industry segments of the European rail companies, they find it very hard to compete. And China is not giving them a chance to compete successfully in the Chinese market. So they learned a bitter lesson the hard way that China is not necessarily signing on to the principle of economic competition and not guaranteeing fair competition. And I think that the automotive sector might be in for a negative surprise as China very fast develops its own export strategy, in particular in the EV sector. And we're now confronted with the fact that European EV business is under heavy pressure from unfair subsidy practices in China that are rigging the market, so that the European Commission has drawn the conclusion that they should start an investigation looking into that and possibly come up with anti-subsidy measures. So clearly the picture is shifting, and the orientation of the Chinese leadership that is not out for reform and opening up, but inversely pursues control and security as their guiding principles, I think the reality forces everybody to draw adequate conclusions. We would be happy to pursue more cooperative relations with the PRC, but it takes two to tango.
Yeah, and we'll be watching closely that development as well. I mean, in Taiwan, Taiwanese businesses' activities in China, and also that's something that's been, I wouldn't say evolving, but that relationship is definitely evolving, and how some have found success, wild success in China, and others have found it to be great hinder to be. Well, as we're wrapping up, I want to turn to 2024 on the elections, a new class of legislators. This means new speakers, new members of the various committees on trade, on foreign relations, on defense. Based on your interactions with the Taiwanese legislators, well, first of all, you've visited Taiwan multiple times. How are you watching the election as a member of the European Parliament?
Well, I think, first of all, I should confess that our relations have been more intense with the Taiwanese government, the executive branches of the government, than with the legislature. We have always included contacts with the legislature, but contacts with ministries or meeting leaders of the executive, including the president, have always been more central. We will continue to show solidarity and to invest in exchanging experience and learning from each other and working together on common goals. So that will not wane. That can be relied upon.
I know Germany is also, you are looking ahead to a next election as well, but you are not running again after 40 years.
Well, there's always a time to say that's been it. In the Old Testament, I think they say there's a time for everything. A time to sow and a time to reap and a time to weep and a time to enjoy. And now for me, it's the time to not run again.
Are you hopeful about the future? Given what you've seen and witnessed and...
Look, there's a very nice phrase by an Italian Marxist thinker of about 100 years ago, Antonio Gramsci, who once said, "I'm a pessimist of reason, but an optimist of will." I would sign on to that statement.
Pessimist of reason and optimist of will. I like that. We will hold on to that.
Or you could put it in other language. I once asked my friend Martin Lee, this octogenarian Hong Kong Democrat, how he put up with all the oppressive realities. And he said, "I just soldier on." I found that very heroic. So that would be an attitude I could adopt.
Thank you for those words of hope as we head into 2024. Well, thank you so much for today, Reinhard, for your time with us, for everything that you shared with us, and for your work and your friendship to Taiwan.
Well, thank you, and I hope we'll meet in person also in the future.
I hope so too. And for our audience, if you would like to see both of the 2-day conferences of the Berlin Taiwan Conference, we'll have the YouTube links in the show notes. This has been a Ghost Island Media production based in Taipei, Taiwan. This episode was produced by me, Emily Waiwu, with help from Gerald Williams. Min Chao is our researcher. Thank you for listening. See you next time.